of a warm up, and then I'll be sharing a lot of resources with you in the hopes that y'all will be able to take them to the spaces that you influence for colleagues. And as John mentioned, just be able to navigate the current socio-political climate in ways that we can best serve young people. Does that sound like it'll be a helpful type of session for y'all? Beautiful. Yes. So I'm getting some thumbs up. I also need lots of affirmation. So periodically you'll just see me like seeking it from you in some format. But it would be really great if you can type into the chat just where y'all are. So I have a sense of who's represented across the state. Hopefully folks got the notification that we are recording this session. Usually Zoom will prompt you and ask you if you're okay with staying. Perfect. Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, it moves so fast. Dutchess County, Ulster, BOCES, Fredonia, Utica, Oswego, way upstate. I love it. Syracuse, GST, BOCES, Charlotte. I don't know where that is. Tell me where it is.
Hi.
Southern Westchester.
Greater Southern Tier.
Oh, perfect.
Corning.
Awesome. Great. Beach Lake, Pennsylvania. Welcome to everyone. I live in Westchester County, so I'm in Harrison. And we're gonna we'll do a land acknowledgement in just a couple of minutes, but I'll do just a brief introduction as to who I am. I've been an educator for about 20 years. I'm also an attorney. So periodically you'll hear me put on my civil rights attorney in this conversation, but I'll tell you up front, when we're talking about anti-bias, anti-racist pedagogy, we are talking about going far beyond what we are legally required to do in terms of creating anti-bias, anti-discriminatory environments in classrooms. Important to note that up front. So the ask is much larger than just what we are required to do by law. And I'll say that as your lawyer on the call. So here we are. A little bit about me. I identify in terms of positionality as a white Puerto Rican cis hetero woman, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I will invite y'all, if you would like to, you can hover over those 3 little dots in the top right-hand corner of your picture and rename yourself. And if you'd like to, you could add your gender pronouns there. I've got mine added there, just as a symbol of understanding and critical reflection on how who we are impacts how we teach, how we engage in these types of spaces. And it's also an invitation to open up dialogue about gender and about sexuality, about intersecting issues when we're talking about race. And you'll hear me as we engage today being very explicit about race, because race is always the hardest piece for folks to navigate, but I don't ever want to be exclusive about it, right? So I want to talk about race and gender and sexuality, race and socioeconomics, race and ability and disability, race and language, all of those layers. And so I'll invite us to take that intersectional lens, but we'll do some defining and such today. My most important role is that I'm the mommy of a 22-month-old. So she is my boss, the director of everything. She is not prone to negotiation or sharing. And she often appears on my Zoom calls. So we'll see. Hopefully not today because we're recording. So let's get rolling. First thing I'll say also, I forgot to mention this, I will share all of these slides with John and the video that we watched today. So you'll get all of this, no worries at all. And anything else that you need, you'll get my contact information. Hopefully we can connect on the Twitter and just stay in touch moving forward, because this work is collective. So I wanted to ground us, start us with a quote. Gotta start with James Baldwin. The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. So I thought we could just start off with some reflections on what these words are sort of speaking to us. I'll stop my screen share so we can all see each other, and I'll copy the quote into the chat so that y'all can see it, and then we'll just dialogue about it for a moment. I'll invite you, you can use the hand raising function, or you can just unmute yourself because we're a small enough group that we should be okay with that, or type your reflections into the chat. But here's the quote. Take a moment to reread it, and what comes up for you when you see those words?
Ali.
Go right ahead. Oh, okay, I'll wait a minute, but if you want to pop in, feel free to unmute yourself. Annie, history shapes us in ways we can't see. Absolutely.
It makes me think about internal and external forces.
Yeah.
Say more about that, Stephanie.
Just things that are who we are through our identification, our family, and then things that are happening currently, both shape us.
Absolutely.
I think the word unconsciously really jumped out in this quote because we walk through it and it's more than just who we are. Sometimes we don't have the control, and by participating in the society in which we live in, we inherently participate in some things such as systemic racism or biases because we go to the store or I purchase a home or I went to school and got a college degree. That's still part of the system, right? And so that was a conversation me and another principal leader that we had a conversation about that just yesterday. So that's why that word kind of like jumped out at me within this quote.
Yeah, I can see it's popping out for other folks in the chat too. I think when we think about issues, particularly systemic racism, we want it to be the shark and not the water, right? We want like the predator. We want the one thing that we can sort of attack. But in reality, when we think about it, it's the water we're all swimming in, right? It's the system, the society we were born into. I hope it's not the one that my daughter will grow up in, but it's the water that we're all internalizing, breathing, swimming in each day. Let's see what else is uplifted here. Wendy, it makes me more aware of the importance about being thoughtful and intentional about everything I do and say. Unconsciously controlled also means we carry conscious and unconscious bias, which appears in our teaching 100%. Either a deep understanding or a total lack of understanding drives our choices and values. Makes me think when a not racist person says slavery was so long ago, why is there still a problem? Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think we could probably do a whole 75 minutes just analyzing James Baldwin's words and the power, but also just, you know, we're in an election season. There's a lot going on. The height of racial polarization in our society right now has sort of feels like we've reached a peak and then we reach another peak and it continues to elevate. And so the one thing that is assured is that we are moving into predictable times of heightened anxiety, of heightened tension. And the one thing I will always say is if you can predict it, you can prepare for it. So there are ways that we want to start thinking about how even our teaching, our content, our pedagogy, our relationships have to be sort of shapeshifters in this particular moment to be responsive, knowing that that socio-political climate finds its way in whether we invite it or not. So thank you all for doing that reflection. I want to make sure that we start off, we're sort of modeling and embodying practices that are going to be important, particularly when we think about anti-bias, anti-racist teaching. And so I will do a land acknowledgement to start us off to let you know here where I am in Harrison, a town in Westchester County. I am on the unceded land of Wappinger and Munsee Lenape people. And what I will say is I don't offer land acknowledgements to sort of check a box and just say we've done this. I offer them as a sign, particularly to the Munsee Lenape people, the Wappinger people who still live with us, to say that my learning is ongoing and that my learning is owed to the land on which I stand. The link that I'm giving you down on the bottom of this slide is actually a GPS map where wherever you are traveling, you can actually see whose indigenous land you are standing on, which is really cool. It's an app that you can add to your phone and you can just go to the website and allow it to search your location and then click through and read a history of some of the people on whose land we are situated so that this type of acknowledgement can have some deeper meaning. It's a great activity to do with young people to really acknowledge, and I've given you some language here, right? A history of colonization, displacement, settler colonialism, imperialism, and genocide. With the intention of acknowledging that we're not just talking about historical figures in time, we are talking about elders, both living and transitioned, to whom we are owing a learning and a commitment to continuously re-indigenizing our teaching. And we'll talk a little bit about how ABAR practices can be a tool to do that. When I start out this type of work, I'm always going to center us in this essential question. It's a question we can ask ourselves individually, but also what we should ask ourselves as collectives. How can I disrupt and dismantle the existence of inequity within my sphere of influence? And in turn, how can we disrupt and dismantle the existence of inequity within our spheres of influence? And these words are chosen intentionally. So systems of inequity can't just be disrupted. They have to be dismantled as meticulously as they were put in place over time, in many cases over generations. And so when we think about the way that we teach social studies, the way that we engage with young people around this content, this type of question should always be forefronted. And by the end of today, I'll give you a number of different types of protocols and frameworks and questions that you can be asking about your teaching and the content, but keeping focused on whether what I am doing is in furtherance of advancing equity, or if it's actually confirming some of the inequities that already exist, is going to be a place where we want our critical reflection to live. And I'll also just start us off, and please, consider even sharing these types of agreements with students, with staff who you work with around difficult conversations. A couple of things I want to say up front. We know these conversations can become uncomfortable and tense, and oftentimes folks have a hard time wading in because they're worried, will I say the wrong thing? How will this be received? Making a couple of agreements up front can be really helpful. So the first thing I'll ask us to think about is that sometimes our impact is not going to reflect our intentions, right? What do I mean by that? You step on my foot and then you say, oh, but Natalie, no, I didn't mean to step on your foot, right? My foot still hurts. You stepped on it. So in this work, we have to focus on the impact and not the intent. If we focus on our intent, then what happens is we end up circling around in defensiveness. Oh, I never thought of that. Oh, that's not what I meant when I said that. That's not why, what I had hoped to do with this document that I put in front of you. Circling around there won't be productive, and it won't be critically reflective in the ways that an anti-bias, anti-racist teacher will have to think about being. And so I'll ask us, and sometimes invite the reminder of intent versus impact. Really clear example, I was an early childhood teacher. So many of us in elementary school do those types of activities where you are asking for young people to talk about their familial history, right? Bring in a history, give us your family tree, tell us a little bit about where your family came from, describe the countries of origin. And, for a family that is the descendants of enslaved people, you are now putting them in positions to explain to their Black 5-year-old, right, a history of enslavement. And that may be not a conversation they were prepared to have at that particular moment or before an assignment is due the next day, right? And so the intentionality and the criticality with which we can think about well-intentioned activity, right, asking folks to reflect on where their families come from. But if we're not acknowledging how the history of enslavement impacts those familial histories in this country, then we aren't being honest about the ways that our teaching can actually impact young people. And so for me, that's a really great impact versus intent type of example, right? Elevating that consciousness to focus on the harm that can be caused even when it isn't meant. Second piece that I think is particularly important is that no one has all of the answers. This is hard. This work is hard. If you feel like you have all the answers, you're doing it wrong. I'm going to ask for you all to sit in positions as learners, right? And that's a position I try to take as well, always doing better, taking every 24 hours as an opportunity to serve young people better. If it were so simple, someone would just write us a book and, I would take it around the country and just tell people what to do. It's not that simple. For many reasons related to the third agreement I'll ask us to make, that you're going to have to sit with some discomfort, right? We're going to do an activity in just a moment that might make us a little bit tense, might make us uncomfortable, but discomfort is a sign of growth. It's a sign of movement, of progress, and that's what we can hope for in this type of work. You don't have to feel like you have all of the answers to be an A-bar educator, but you do have to feel like you are consistently seeking them, even when it causes you to feel a little bit uncomfortable. Brian also uplifting I statements instead of listening. That's the person who is not open to the hard work. Absolutely. Speaking just from our own perspective. And again, not feeling as if we constantly have to have a response. I'm working with a lot of educators right now who are, opening up their initial conversations with young people, asking them, what are you worried about in this moment? And young people are carrying so much worry. and so much anxiety because of loss, because of sickness that they've experienced, because of financial trauma, food insecurity. And oftentimes as an educator, when we receive all of that, we feel as if we have to give something back. My suggestion is give gratitude back for sharing those pieces of stories. Give gratitude back by displaying that you have an understanding of structural racism, right? But not necessarily feeling as if you have to consistently have answers, particularly when we're talking about teaching across race and teaching across other identity points. So we'll stick with these couple of assumptions up front. I'll ask you to hold these and bring us back to them if we need to during our conversations. But here's the plan for today. You'll saw the description of this session, so we don't need to spend too much time on this. Really just want to leave you by the end of this time with some critical protocols for reflection, hopefully have pushed you to think in a couple of different ways and left you with some great resources to hold on to. So hold us accountable to that by the end. So the first thing we're going to do is ask this question and engage in an activity. How am I situated in both historical and contemporary oppression? And this activity is called Peeling Back the Onion. I'll give you that beautiful visual of an onion just to hold on to for a moment. And while you do, if you can gather 5 small pieces of paper and something to write with, you will need those. So you could take a Post-it, rip it into 5 pieces, and then something to write with. I'll give you a moment to do that. Okay. So with that image of the onion in your mind, your 5 pieces of paper, can be little tiny pieces of paper, are now your onion. And this activity is going to help us get to our core. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is write down one of your identities on a piece of paper, and I'll tell you which category. What I'll tell you up front though is that what you have to write down is not, you don't have to share anything out loud. This is just for you, and that's important to say up front. So what you write down is just for you. So take your first piece of paper and write down how you identify in terms of race and ethnicity. And this is just for you. And take your second piece of paper and write down how you identify in terms of gender. It's just for you. You won't have to share out loud. Take your third piece of paper and write down how you identify in terms of sexual orientation. And take your fourth piece of paper and write down how you identify, if at all, in terms of religion, spirituality. I'm typing them into the chat too, if that's helpful. And then your last piece of paper, write down how you identify in terms of immigration status or nationality. Okay, and now you don't need your pen anymore. So looking at these 5 pieces of paper, this is your onion. And what we are trying to do is to get as close to the core as possible. So taking a look at these 5, if you peel away one of the outer layers of your onion, it's still going to leave 4 pieces of who you are closest to your core. Select which piece you can peel away and just put it to the side. I'll repeat the prompt. If you're looking at these 5, these are your onion, and we're trying to get to the core. So we're going to peel away one of these layers, put it to the side, and have 4 of the pieces that are closest to our core in front of us. In a shocking turn of events, we're going to do it again. So peel away another layer of your onion, put it to the side. It's gonna leave you with 3 pieces of who you are closest to your core. I think the people that I can see are mostly sitting down, so that's good because we're gonna do it again. Peel away another layer, put it over to the side, and now you should have 2 pieces of who you are closest to your core, the core of your onion. And for those of you with particularly astute deductive reasoning skills, we're doing it again. One final time. Peel away that last layer, and you should just be left with 1 piece of who you are closest to your core. So what did that activity feel like? Let me ask folks first. Let's start with the heart before we move to the head. What did it feel like? Feel free to unmute yourself, type in the chat. What did it feel like?
For me, it was similar to doing a values inventory, really, like you said, getting down to the core. And I had in the last 2, I had a difficult time deciding which was going to be the last piece.
Thank you for that, Wendy. Other folks want to unmute and share? Some comments in the chat. Difficult, weird, hard to rank, hard to decide, challenging to determine what to eliminate. I felt like the first 2 were easier to eliminate. Any other thoughts on how it felt?
I was glad I was doing it in private. Like it felt, like I was thinking if someone was sitting next to me, I don't think I could do this as comfortably. Like it was uncomfortable, don't get me wrong, but it would have heightened that level of uncomfortableness if someone was near me and reading what I had wrote down.
I often do this activity with students and they will literally build a fortress around, right? Like literally, or I just encourage folks to write really, really small so that no one can see when we're all in the same room together. Brian feels easy in the beginning, but predictable by the end. I know the one thing that drives all my choices and would probably change many of those choices if it was different. Yeah. So let's intellectualize this a little bit. Why do you think we would do this type of activity in the context of A-bar education? What do y'all think?
So ultimately, like, not that we're going to, but if we were to hold up our signs, I think we would all identify the fact that we, at our core, are associate differently. Like it's not all the same. We're not going to all pick up the same thing. We're not going to. And I think sometimes while that's easy to say, it's a lot more to like take a look at it and that be the reality. That makes sense.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering, because at first I was doing this just looking at myself, but then I kind of turned it around. And I think the thing that I landed on, or I wonder, the thing that I landed on as my core, is that what my perspective is as I look at others? Is that what I first notice in others? So if my, the thing that I know that I kept as most intimate were either my race, ethnicity, or the way I identify myself in terms of my nationality or my linkage that way, then if it is indeed the way I see others, that that really labels them in a way that would be uncomfortable and unfair for me as well as them.
That is a really beautiful reflection. I think that the point of this, right, is to think about if the construction of your onion is different than those who you teach, than those who you work with, how does that matter, right? When we're thinking about ways to be more inclusive, ways to be more equitable. More specifically, if it's very easy for me to peel away as one of those first layers, the fact that I'm a US citizen, right? I don't move about the world thinking much about my citizenship status, but I serve undocumented students. Then how would an inclusive classroom space and curricular content ever serve each of us in ways that made us, be able to bring our whole selves? Because if my onion is in alignment or misalignment with the students I serve, that matters greatly in my teaching, right? And so this activity first shows us it's really hard for adults to talk about their feelings. And I think that when you're trying to access A-bar education at a really authentic level, you have to come in at the heart level. You have to feel this emotionally. And for some of us, entering a conversation about addressing racism in schools is an intellectual exercise, right? It's something we can opt into or opt out of. We can select to go to the session. We can select not to. But for others, for colleagues, for other educators, for some of the students that we serve, engaging with racism is a daily thing, right? Because you're on the receiving end. And so how does that matter when we think about racial inclusivity? So if it was easy for me to peel away my race, but race would be the card that a young person in my class would hold closest to their core, what would racial equity look like in that context? And we could switch that sentence to insert gender, sexuality. We could pull out any of these component identities. The other piece that's really important for me to name is that I forced you into boxes, right? There was an intentionality with which you had to choose categories that I gave you, because that's how the world sees us. The world makes constructions of us all the time, right? And this is where the bias component comes in. Whether we identify in those ways or not, stories are told the minute we walk into spaces. The minute you saw me on the screen, stories were told about who I am or who I might be, right? And so this would have been a very different activity if I said to you, write down 5 ways you identify. And then we went through the same process. Because some of you, I imagine, may have chosen categories that I didn't give you the option to choose, right? And so imagine a space, an anti-bias space, that actually would afford young people the opportunity to tell stories about who they are in the context and the narrative in the ways that they want to. How would it impact the way that they learn about people, the people who they relate to, the people who they come from, the people whose wisdom they rely on, right? How would that matter? And so I like this activity for the way that it forces us into boxes, but it forces us into unavoidable critical reflection, which to me, if you're going to be an A-bar educator, is a space you have to consistently live in, right? So thank you for engaging in that and for sharing some of what it brought up for you. I want to shift and bear some of the cognitive load for just a couple of minutes and give you some definitions just to make sure we're all kind of situated in the same conversation. Many of you may be familiar with the New York State Department of Education's framework for culturally responsive and sustaining education. My office were co-authors on this document. It is a 74-page rich document on State Ed's website. It's got a really great glossary. And I wanted to highlight just 2 of the definitions from that document to situate us in where we are. So racial justice is the systematic fair treatment of people of all races that results in equitable opportunities and outcomes for everyone. All people are able to achieve their full potential in life, regardless of race, ethnicity, or the community in which they live. And this is the really sage part. Racial justice or racial equity goes beyond anti-racism. It's not just about what we're against, but it's also what we are for. A culturally responsive and sustaining education framework should move us from a reactive posture to a more powerful, proactive, and even preventative approach. And that's really sage to think about, because we often don't spend enough time envisioning that what's the address we want to put into the GPS, right? What is the racially just social studies curriculum? Right? What does that look like? And if we haven't had space to think about that, then how could we possibly ever backwards plan to get there, right? And so thinking about this with some intentionality, I find to be really helpful. And hopefully some of this content you can take and use in other spheres that you influence. From the same document, this is how culturally responsive and sustaining education is defined. 5 components, right? Ever so simple, not so simple at all. Affirms racial, linguistic, and cultural identities, prepares students for rigor and independent learning, develops students' abilities to connect across lines of difference, elevates historically marginalized voices, and empowers students as agents of social change, right? Just do these 5 things, check these off. This is not simple, right? And so the thing to think about is what is driving us each day, right? To get to a level of commitment and change. Because my argument to you, I told you I was a lawyer, so I'm gonna make arguments up front. Our schools have always been culturally responsive. The question is to whose culture? So this is an image of Thomas More before and after he entered school in Saskatchewan in 1874. My argument to you is that his school was responsive, just not to his culture. And so the question becomes for us in this moment, in 2020, in the midst of a pandemic, to whose culture are we most responsive? And arguably the even more important question, to whose culture are we least responsive? And why does that matter in our teaching? And how do we assess that? And how do we assess the impact on relationships, right? That's really the space that ABAR practices will have to live in. Oops. Can you all hear me? I just clicked something. Zoom invites me to click the wrong things. I blame Zoom. Okay, so first reference to some resources in addition to the NYSID framework. So we have a CRE hub. That's the website. There is a ton of great stuff on that website, including what we call CRE stories, which are very short films that we have created to give you a sense of what CRE actually looks like in practice. There is a discussion protocol for each of the films, and then there's also a resource list, so some suggested readings as a result of the different topics. We're going to watch one of those films today. Also on the CRE Hub are a bunch of tools that we have created, including this one that you see the cover image of on the left, Transforming Our Public Schools, a guide to culturally responsive and sustaining education. And this tool has some really great questions, and I think I'll show you a couple of them after we watch this short video. Questions we can begin to ask about our curriculum and our pedagogy in the context of becoming more responsive and sustaining, and thinking with intentionality about how to foster anti-bias, anti-racist spaces. There's documents on here about reopening, remote learning. There's tons of great resources engaging with families, so I highly suggest checking out what you can access there on the CRE Hub. But the first thing that we will do now is take a moment to watch this short clip, and then we'll come back on the other side. Oops, not that side.
Culturally responsive education for me is the understanding that children are people, and without building relationships and without understanding children, we can't teach them.
When I'm trying to find myself or find my identity, I go towards art and I go towards poetry, but I feel like when I'm in the school system, they always try to define you by your numbers.
It was the first day of biology class, and the teacher, in her southern accent, was just like, all right, I'm just gonna get this off my chest now. I'm not gonna remember any of your names, you know, because all of you got the same hair color and the same eye color.
Growing up, I had a really hard time finding an interest in reading. A lot of the literature that we read talked about topics and experiences that were not that relevant to me. The closest we would come to was probably the narratives of immigrants who came from Ellis Island, but even then, there was still some kind of disconnect. I remember noting that these people were welcomed here, whereas my community, they're shunned.
When a few other students and I had approached different history teachers specifically about teaching about LGBTQ culture, either we got the response from teachers that they didn't feel comfortable teaching about LGBTQ history because they didn't identify, or we got the response that they're against teaching LGBTQ history within schools.
When I began teaching, I thought I had to know everything, and I had to control everything. I need to assign your seats, tell you when you can get up, lecture to you, write down all of these things, regurgitate it back to me, and if you did that, fantastic. And nothing about your culture was welcomed into the classroom.
Yo he vivido en carne propia, yo he visto y escuchado cómo los maestros hablan de los niños. Cada día dice, llegan los niños y no traen un lápiz, o a veces no traen los cuadernos, y muchos niños llegan con hambre, muchos niños llegan con problemas en el hogar, y yo no tengo tiempo para estar tratando con esos niños.
I had over an hour and a half commute every day just to get to middle school in 8th grade. And I was always late. I was always late. I was always sleeping. I was tired. I was depressed. And not once did he ask me why.
My parents stopped going to parent-teacher meetings in middle school. A lot of the teachers just went with that, right? That they didn't think, okay, well, this 12-year-old is filling out all these forms and also just signing her parents' name. There was no effort to make them a part of this world.
En una conferencia de padres en el primer grado, estaba teniendo dificultades para la pronunciación de algunas palabras. La única pregunta que ella me hizo fue qué idioma hablábamos en casa. Así que cuando yo le contesté que todos hablábamos español en casa, ella dijo que probablemente ese era el problema y ella no tuvo ninguna otra respuesta.
In New York City, 85% of students identify as Black, Latinx, or Asian. We know that across the country and in New York, 60% of the teaching force is white.
There were a couple Black teachers, guidance counselor, assistant principal that came into the school and often left like within a year.
We are often asked to be the dean. And of course, if we're not the dean, then we're the assistant principal who takes care of discipline. You're not letting us build those relationships.
The way that we've been teaching comes from the 19th century factory system. When we say decolonizing our practice and decolonizing education, it is first questioning what you think is normal and right and the way that it should go. Question, where did this come from?
When was the last time a student learned about Haiti? When was the last time a student learned about Colombia?
Por ejemplo, mis hijos sí han viajado a México, han tenido la oportunidad de convivir con la familia que está allá y hay tantas cosas que cada vez que van ellos vienen sorprendidos porque no la conocen. Y va más allá de los tacos y de los mariachis.
I want everyone to be able to know, along with myself, about my heritage. I want people to be able to say where they are from without it having to be kind of like a personal question, a question that you ask a friend.
The way you teach, how you teach it, and why you teach it. From what perspective are you teaching? The biggest thing is that people, educators, don't want to address race, gender, power, and privilege.
I remember one time when I first began to get South Asian students into the classroom. There was a young girl who came to the classroom and her parents had put Mindy on her hand. I said, oh honey, you shouldn't be writing on your hand. And then she explained to me that it was part of the celebration for either Eid or Diwali. I had to reach out to the families to find out what it was about, understand their culture a little bit more. I tried to bring in a way that we could celebrate those cultures into the classrooms.
Welcoming families in. Having teachers and staff come out of the school building to really learn about the communities that they're in.
Muchos padres deberían de involucrarse porque nuestros niños están sufriendo, porque mis hijas mismas al verme a mí involucrada y con la pasión, ellas se apasionan.
As our country is becoming more and more diverse, we need to use the indigenous practices of storytelling, of music, of conversation. It's not like I have 52 different countries and 3 languages, so I have to figure out how to CRE. No. All of those students come from an indigenous culture that values community, that values cooperation. And that's how you start to engage students in CRE.
We created an all-boys class, and we also created like boys reading groups at that time. They read Decoded by Jay-Z, which is his memoir, and they also read the autobiography of Malcolm X. I don't think it's a coincidence that that was also the same year that we just shot up in terms of our academic growth across the board.
I've been very fascinated with the idea of students doing the teaching. Me very much pulling away from the board. I try to make sure that students feel like they have a sense of agency in the math. I ask them to think critically about the math that's in front of them.
A lot of kids feel as if is about like SATs, ACTs, getting these high grades, and they don't develop their individuality. It's like that carbon copy, but you're forgetting that you're human. Like, find that thing about you that makes you different from everyone else.
When we negate people the opportunity to learn their legacy and what brought them into this world, we don't give them the space to fully love themselves.
Our goal is for our kids to graduate from us with a level of consciousness, conscious of who they are and what they bring to the table, conscious of their history and conscious of the world that they live in and how to navigate that from a place of strength.
That's cultural responsiveness. It's challenging the adults in the building to do right by every child and therefore doing right by themselves.
All right, so we stop sharing our screen so we can see each other's faces. What reflections do you have on the film, and what does it make you think about in terms of our teaching, our pedagogy, our relationships? What comes up for you?
It makes me think that, at least in my education growing up, and then before, when I used to be a classroom teacher, it was really education through a white man's eyes.
Absolutely. And I think we're still reading a lot of sources that come through that gaze in this moment. And so how are we flipping the script, right? How are we asking questions of, you know, if we told this history from someone else's perspective, from the folks who are marginalized and underrepresented in this space, how would that shift the way we're thinking about it, right? How do we essentially flip the teaching and flip the source? And I'll give some questions to ask about that when we're thinking specifically about curricular units. What else came up?
Could I go back and like in time and reteach a different way and a different perspective, as much as we tried to do it, and not knowing that some of the things that we were looking at in our curriculums were part of the issue, and just didn't have a second glance at it necessarily. But now that we know better, we do better, right? And so.
You know, at the very end of the movie, it talked about, you know, we're all humans, and we come with unique stories, and it's how we connect with each other. You know, I'm a huge Brene Brown fan, and her work around empathy and connection and, you know, living a wholehearted life. Like, there are so many things, so many ways that we can help our students by just giving them voice. And giving them a platform where they feel safe and they can be heard. I don't know, that kind of, all of those types of thinking as I was watching the video kind of came up for me.
I saw Catherine added to the chat, education is relationships, personal, and our student stories, the importance of empathy, of inclusivity. Absolutely, Carrie. And really, and so, you know, the question for me becomes, there's such power, right, in hearing the impact of not feeling represented, not feeling that your family is represented, that your history is represented in the curriculum. There is something about that. I work with, you know, so many districts right now that have begun forming committees and explicit commitments to anti-bias, anti-racist teaching, which is great. But we also want to have an elevated consciousness of who is shouldering the burden of this work, right? The emotional burden, the logistical burden, the, you know, job description burden, because I've seen in a lot of different spaces, particularly predominantly white spaces, that we go naturally to the Black, Indigenous folks of color in the space to guide us, to lead this work. And that's like sort of doubly problematic, because you're asking the folks who are marginalized and impacted by the harm to also be the ones to recreate the new reality, right, of inclusivity. And so even an elevated consciousness of our individual roles and where we are seeking our education, and I say this intersectionally, so as a cis educator, and cis is me using the short word for cisgender, right? I am not going to rely on a transgender student of mine to be my educator on what gender inclusivity could look like in the classroom, right? I will have to seek those commitments and do that work and show my receipts to my students, right? In ways that don't further impact those who are already being harmed. And that's hard. And that often complicates sort of where you are reaching out to. But hopefully, you know, by the end of this session, by the end of the conversations you're having over these couple of days, you're getting a sense that there are lots of educators, thousands of educators, even just across our state, but across the country, that are seeking out these same types of questions. They're seeking out answers together. This work can't be done individually. It can't be like you as one dynamic individual in a district putting forth the agenda, because then when you leave, there's no infrastructure, right? So the question for me is, how are we building community around this work? Again, back to an indigenous practice of community building. We here in the US live in a very individualistic society, right? Which prompts us to think in terms of problem solving by ourselves without the support of community. But for those of us who come from collectivist origins, right, problem solving happened around the dinner table. It happened in community for me. It happened with uncles and aunts and my abuela and folks, you know, in conversation together. I never felt alone in that capacity. So problem solving in this regard should also invite building collectives and networks and connecting with folks around the state who are deeply engaged in this work. As a one positive of having more of these virtual opportunities, we can take this as an opportunity to facilitate more of those types of connections, right? Today being an example of one of them. My hope is that this is the beginning of our connection, that you will call upon me when you are, you know, seeking out particular resources or, you know, signing up for our newsletter to start to come for some of our events. You're not alone in this work, and you're not alone if you're thinking how sort of daunting it can be. So the document that I had mentioned before the film has these really rich questions, and I'll invite you, you know, to go onto the CRE Hub and kind of pour through them a little bit during your free time when you could put your feet up, you know, have a cup of coffee and relax. But the one I wanted to highlight here, this third bullet, does your public school teach history and literature in ways that are inclusive of perspectives and wisdom of the communities students come from? There's even this intentionality I as a facilitator use, particularly as being a white Latinx facilitator in this work, to the voices I invite into the space. So when I'm showing clips, when I'm citing scholarship, when I'm inviting references into the room, I am citing Black women. I am citing Black men, right? I am citing Black trans scholars. I am thinking of all of the ways that I cannot offer perspective in this moment. And so bringing in voices, particularly of BIPOC folks, with intentionality around their wisdom and their brilliance, right? So oftentimes when we just take a look at our curriculum, the voices and the representations and the histories that we are learning of BIPOC people are those that tell histories of hardship and challenge, and only one snippet of a people. And so with intentionality, we will have to think about the ways that we leverage joy and brilliance and wisdom with intentionality in terms of what we put in front of our young people, right? And BIPOC, so you'll hear me using that language to be inclusive, Black, Indigenous, people of color, being really intentional that we live in an anti-Black society. So making sure that Black people are not lumped in with sort of people of color inclusively, but there's a real intentionality talking about anti-Blackness. And then ABAR educators will have to think in terms of intentionality. Clearly we want to drop this word minority 100%. The word minority, A, makes people feel small and isn't even accurate, right? So another term to use, which can be inclusive, is people of the global majority, which is totally accurate, right? Because BIPOC folks are people of the global majority across the globe right now. So even ways we're using language can be really super intentional and reflective of who we are hoping to be. You'll also hear me naming very concretely when we talk about bias, and you know, the hot words are implicit bias, unconscious bias. You can't talk about bias without talking about structural inequities. And this is a great article by the National Equity Project that you'll get the link to this when I share the materials. but thinking about how racism is fueled by misogyny, by homophobia, by transphobia, Islamophobia, xenophobia, right, ableism. All of those are in conversation with and fueling racism and systems of racism. And so we have to be really clear when we talk about bias that we're honest that these are all branches of the same tree, right? It's not just about individual people. We are taking a system-wide lens. And that's going to be truly important if you're thinking about ABAR practices concretely. I also mentioned this up front, but just wanted to have it kind of clearly named in a space that I'm going to ask you to be explicit about race, because race is always the hardest for folks to talk about, but not exclusive about it. So taking that intersectional lens, making sure that we are talking about the intersections of how race and gender play together, race and disability, right? Race and socioeconomics, all of those ways that these identities are comprised, those pieces of our onions are in conversation with each other, right? And how that matters greatly when we are thinking about better serving children from this ABAR perspective. Let me just pull for you, because I want this to be kind of as concrete as possible, sharing resources with y'all that you can take to different spaces. So the first thing, if you're not familiar with, there was an opportunity, and they've done it a couple of times, they may do it again. It's called the Liberate and Chill Collective. And they have offered about a 6-week learning series. They let you share the materials and have access to the materials for a longer period of time than just that. But it's an ongoing learning series. It's all virtual. You can access a dashboard to connect with and be in conversation with other folks who are really on the same journey of trying to navigate ABAR education. And this is their definition, which I love and I think is super helpful to think about and kind of unpack with the educators who we work with. So the anti-bias and anti-racist part are not interchangeable. And I think that's really important to name, because often I will hear educators use these and sort of conflate the terms together. Anti-bias work is more broad. It's more focused on inclusivity across a variety of identities. Anti-racism work has to be very explicit, right? Which takes us back to that, explicit notions of always focusing on race, where it's uncomfortable for folks to be able to dive in. So ABAR education supports children's full development in multiracial, multilingual, multicultural world, and gives them the tools to stand up to prejudice, stereotyping, bias, and eventually to all those institutional isms, right? And many of you may be familiar with Louise German Sparks' work as sort of like foundational to thinking about anti-bias education. It's an orientation to education that not only acknowledges racism and bias at the core of the educational system, but also explicitly works to disrupt that system with the goals of equity and justice for marginalized communities. So that's the explicit focus on racism. And we're gonna have to share an understanding of racism. Far too often, we're hearing some folks talk about interpersonal racism, right? That's what we think about immediately without talking about systems. The fact that I, as your attorney, could bring you my evidence from the education system, from the healthcare system, from the housing system, from healthcare, and show you the ways that there are racial disparities across all of those institutions. And that still wouldn't be the whole system, because we'd have to also talk about structural racism, which is the wealth and income gaps accumulated by race over generations. So if we're speaking in different terms, if one of us is talking about interpersonal racism and another is talking about systemic, there's no way we're going to be able to meet around this type of work. So definitions, the defining is going to be really, really important. One organization I highly recommend if you're interested in kind of continuing to engage, to follow, is called Race Forward. They put out a newsletter called Color Lines. They're very intentional in terms of their racial justice work and reports that they put out. So I would highly recommend checking them out. And thank you, John, for the time warning as we begin to wind down. I just love the Twitter and the Instagram snapshots of quotes that I can take. One of the biggest missteps that I see in schools, when trying to implement anti-racist practices, is believing that the issue solely lies outside of the building and outside of themselves, right? So rather focusing on, how have I been engaged with this system my entire life? What do I have to disorient myself to as an anti-bias, anti-racist educator in order to better serve children? Giving you a note here just about the term BIPOC, so that you can have that. And this is from the BIPOC Project, the source. We use the term BIPOC to highlight the unique relationship to whiteness that Indigenous and Black or African American people have, which shapes the experiences of and relationship to white supremacy for all people of color within a US context. We unapologetically focus on and center relationships among BIPOC folks. So helpful clarity there. Also just noting, as I mentioned earlier, that BIPOC folks are people of the global majority, which makes this the accurate representation across the world, and just yet another reason never to say the word minority, although lawyer hat again, our laws have not caught up to that. So all of our laws use language and regulations of, selecting minority and women-owned businesses, right? We can say BIPOC owned businesses when we're thinking about vendors to come in and serve our schools. Couple of resources I want to leave you with. If y'all have not yet checked out Goldie Muhammad's work, I cannot elevate her brilliance in enough ways. What I am offering to you, this is her book, but this is actually a snapshot of a framework that she offered, thinking specifically about curriculum units on the abolitionist teaching webinar, which I'm also linking to there because you'll have access to that. These questions are just rich questions to ask about any curriculum unit. How does it teach my students to learn something about themselves or others? How does it make my students become smarter about something outside of those concrete skills? What new people, places, and things am I teaching? What kind of histories am I unearthing that they may not have learned before? And how would this unit plan advance my students' thinking about equity, power, and anti-oppression? So you can definitely see how these questions are in furtherance of the goals of the CRSE definition that we looked at the beginning, right? These are the types of things I should be asking myself. And then, because I just can't help myself, I wanted to give you some thoughts in a framework, and I trying to pick those cheesy, like catchy phrases we can hang on to. So complexify, complicate, and problematize. I don't actually know if all of those are words, but we'll go with it. These are the things I want us to think about, particularly when we're talking about our social studies work. So examining where you're teaching the history of a people from the point at which they were colonized, forced from their homeland, murdered in a genocide, enslaved. That's not only telling one portion of a story, but it's giving a very negative perspective, a very disempowered perspective of a people. And we know that if we're taking a look at what the Regents is actually going to test on, that is going to give us such a limited slice of the histories of people who we are inviting into the classroom. So I'm going to ask us to complexify the history that we teach, to broaden that, make sure that there is more of a narrative, right, about groups of people with intentionality. Examining the textured characters of current and historical figures. I think too often we just accept that this is a person our students should know about in terms of history that influences us still today. And that doesn't give enough of the texture of who that person is. We can complicate it, right? We can make sure that there's some problems in the narrative of this person, that we offer the challenges of who they were, giving folks a full perspective, really, to be able to make critical decisions on their own of what they think about it. So this idea of complexifying, what we teach. Understanding who you represent to your students. So this is very salient for me. So as a white educator, if I am teaching a history of enslavement, and I have not acknowledged that when I walk into the classroom, I embody the enslaver, I embody the colonizer, right? And if I'm serving Black and brown children, then the question becomes, have I really interrogated how I am teaching this content? If I am a white educator embodying the enslaver, teaching white students, have I afforded them the opportunity to do the reflection that they are the descendants of the enslavers, right? We are far too often very focused on talking about enslaved people, without acknowledging the enslavers ourselves and where we are positioned in that history. And so for me, as an educator, I need to have an opportunity to kind of complicate even just who I represent when I walk into a space and why that matters in terms of who I, how I teach and my relationships with young people. Add 3 dimensions to sources. So here, not just talking about individuals, but people, institutions, governments, organizations. I think this is particularly salient in 2020, but just adding some layers to the way that we are looking at institutions and not accepting just straight narratives that don't give us some of that texture, right? So complicating notions of power and privilege and why that matters, back to some of the voices that we heard in the film. Forecast predictable moments of heightened anxiety. So I just literally scheduled my first session for November 4th and then took a breath and realized, wow, November 4th. We're in an election season. Are we even going to know the results of the election on November 4th? I don't know, but I can predict for a number of reasons, for a number of people, that is going to be a predictably heightened time of anxiety, of stress, of emotion. And so just taking a look with intentionality at my own units and saying, what's coming around that time? Where's there flexibility for me to be responsive, to shape shift? As administrators, is there an opportunity for us to provide support to staff who may need a space around that particular time? And that's really just one example. I think living in a pandemic, we can predict upcoming times that may be particularly heightened. Obviously, testing time, holiday time, always times of heightened anxiety, heightened stress for educators and students. And so just a consciousness of how what I'm teaching at that moment is interacting with and allowing for a space to be responsive to the populations that I serve. And then finally, thinking about how curriculum is actually in conversation with the current socio-political climate or not, and why that matters. Problematizing some of the plans that I have. It is uncomfortable, right? We said that up front. We laid those agreements up front to talk about issues, particularly where we don't have all the answers, particularly where we ourselves may be undergoing stress and trauma and anxiety about what's happening in the world. But better that we create that climate to be a space where we can talk about that as a shared experience, as opposed to trying to avoid it. So all of those classrooms that avoid talking about race, talking about gender, power, and privilege, they're actually saying a lot about race, gender, power, and privilege, right? They're discounting that they actually matter. And so the silence on these issues is always going to speak volumes. And really the question becomes, how am I pushing back against that? So you'll have all of these to share, to continue to do some reflection. But I thought to leave you also with just some individual points of reflection when we're thinking about this racial equity lens. What's your relationship to the community where you serve and impact children, whether that's direct or indirect? Are you a member of the community? Are you a guest in the community? Why does that matter? How does your racial identity impact the way you teach, engage, and relate to the young people that you serve? That's that onion question. So how is your onion in alignment with or misalignment with that of your students? When race, power, and privilege come up in interactions with students and colleagues, how are you making those efforts to promote equity and inclusivity? How are you opening doors as opposed to closing them when it feels uncomfortable? And then what specific pedagogical and relational moves are you making to advance racial justice? And these are points of reflection to take with you on an individual level, to share with others, but to really dive into some of the resources that I'm going to share with you that will give you a sense of sort of how to navigate that space. And to that end, I want to make sure that you have a good set of resources to pour through. So first I'm going to show you a quote from an educator who I work with, who is just an amazing person, Jillian McRae, and this quote is really salient for me. Once you are aware, you are responsible. And so now that we're aware and now that we're responsible, what steps are we taking to shift what we do? So this last document is actually just a compilation of resources, and I try to make it as easy as possible for folks to access. So when you click through, this will take you to our CRE hub, but I've also outlined a couple of the documents that I find to be most helpful that are there on the hub. Linking to the NYSID framework, a couple of blog pieces, some webinars that have been really rich, and then some really great articles specifically on AVAR practices and how to think about trauma-informed spaces, what that means, elevating consciousness. This is like the one pager of what I find to be the most salient pieces that have come out over the summer and most recently in terms of this work. So I'll put that link in the chat now just so that you have it. But I will send all these materials to John and make sure that y'all get them. I know that was a lot. What do we think? Questions, thoughts? Something you're taking with you?
How little I know and how not to get paralyzed by how much I don't know, and to not let that be a barrier to knowing where to start.
I love that so much because I meet too many educators who are like, well, I'm just not ready. We're not ready. You're never going to feel 100% ready. It's never going to feel like the right time. And let's not wait until we have another crisis in society, in our communities, in our schools to be the driver, because then you're in reactive posture, right? You're reacting to one individual moment in time. And this is so much bigger. So I think that the more that you can feel exactly what you've described, Betsy, that this is bigger than us, that it's difficult, there's a lot, I'm starting from a place where there's more that I don't know than I do, that's the right position to be in and to be open to it.
Thank you.
Natalie, I just want to plug the Cafe Con Metro series that NYU is putting out. I think it's starting again in October. But those were bi-monthly Zoom chats in the evenings with a group of like-minded educators. And it really was, in so many ways, like the best hour of the week. Like we were able to share ideas and thoughts and resources, and you always left feeling really hopeful about the future and the work that people are doing. So I can't say it enough that that we need to get more people from across New York State involved in that group.
What is the name of that group again, please?
It's called Café con Metro. So I'll put the, I don't actually know if the latest flyer, because as Catherine said, we're just starting like the next cycle. The next one is going to be on October 7th. But I put our Twitter account in the chat. If you follow us on the Twitter or go on our website, if you're not on the Twitter, here's our website, and sign up for the newsletter, you'll get all the announcements. And it's free, and it's just these great spaces to bring educators together from across the country. We've had some folks from Minnesota, just all over, engaged in this work, and it's been a great space. And it's hosted by myself and then a number of other directors from across different teams at Metro Center. A great reason to sign up for our newsletter is that there's 14 different units at the Metro Center. So I'm just representing one of them. I run the Equity and Racial Justice fee-for-service arm of the Metro Center, but there are teams that work directly with multilingual learners, with students with disabilities, like a range of folks, some who work just exclusively with students. And so there's a lot going on. We host a lot of events and conferences, even in the virtual space. We've entirely shifted over. So you'll find a lot if you sign up for our newsletter.
Thank you.
Of course. Well, this was really my pleasure. We've 1:45 on the nose. I don't know what comes next for you, if there are other sessions for today, but this was really my absolute pleasure. I thank you, John, and everyone who organized it. I will share all the materials. I'll also just put my email right now into the chat if there's anything in particular that y'all need. You'll find me on Twitter also. There's my email. It's been my pleasure. I hope that you take care of yourselves during all that is going on. Drink water, take a pause, get air outside. It's a lot, and I'm with you through this, but I want to acknowledge there's so much going on. So I appreciate having the moment to just center learning around this content, because I really think this is the most important work we can be doing in this particular moment. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.